Yeah, dear ladies and gentlemen, first I want to thank you very much for this conference and for inviting me. It's really an honor, and I'm very happy to start with this term also. I'm very happy to be among such a prominent scholars and to have a possibility to contribute a small contribution from an Islamic perspective on this monumental theme that we are dealing with, happiness. And I was really very much enjoy listening to my both previous speakers, and I have an impression that I don't have much to say more, but I promised George Tamer to give a lecture, so I have to deliver something. But two short remarks maybe before I begin. Of course, as it is inevitable not to use Arabic terms and Arabic names in the framework of this paper, of this presentation. So I will confront you with some Arabic terminology and some names. I hope not very much. And I have also to add, before I start, that there is much more that I left out as I included in my paper. So, but this will come, I hope, then for the publication. So, without further ado, because the time is running, I suppose, and it's always short, so I will start with a kind of Prolegomenon, which I entitled Ambiguous Unambiguity of Happiness. And actually, it corresponds to that what we already heard in some way. It can be observed that happiness serves as a universal concept and as the ultimate aspiration across various religious and spiritual traditions. Nonetheless, as Sayyid Hussein Nasr correctly notes, the particular manifestations, descriptions, and ways of pursuing happiness are culturally influenced and also contextualized. If, on the one hand, happiness is a universal and fundamental human experience, it is, on the other hand, a very individual, subjective, and subtle phenomena, since it is not so clear at all what the term happiness is exactly referring to in particular cases. Now, the first thinker to draw attention to this problem was, of course, Aristotle, who was convinced that there is no universal good common to all cases, situations, and circumstances. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he though admits that everyone agrees that happiness, eudaimonia, is the highest good and therefore the highest goal of humans, but that there is a substantial difference in opinions on what way of life counts as doing and living well. Although happiness seems to present a primary goal, which is sought after in human life, it remains relative from various perspectives, since there is neither a final nor a uniform general accepted definition of happiness. The diversity and variety of concepts of happiness that individuals aim to achieve is highly subjective and generally influenced by several factors such as culture, religion, social background, education, personal experiences, and emotional states. But this applies not only to individuals, but also to our whole intellectual and spiritual traditions as such. Thus, different schools of ethics and different religious traditions have, of course, different views on happiness. It is this, in this sense that I refer to happiness as ambiguous unambiguity. The idea of happiness and the pursuit of it have been taken up by many thinkers in history, include Muslim scholars, philosophers, and mystics. I would even argue that especially in Islam, happiness is one of the key concepts in understanding human life in its relation to the being in the world, fi dunya, or in the Weltsein, as well as in relation to the eschatological dimension of human existence, fil akhirah. As renowned Malaysian philosopher Naqib al-Atas states, happiness is one of the core concepts of the Islamic Weltanschauung, alongside concepts such as God, Creator, revelation, religion, creation, human nature or soul, deep knowledge, freedom, as well as values and virtues. In my presentation, I will attempt to examine the concept of happiness in the Islamic contexts, plural. For this purpose, I will first try to present the most important features of the Quranic understanding of happiness, reflecting primarily on different Arabic terms used in the Quran, such as saʿīda, aflaḥa, fariḥa, Fawz. I will then focus on the mainstream perspectives on happiness in the classical Islamic philosophy, Falsafa, in the tradition of Falsafa, and Sufi mysticism, tasawwuf, my main area of research, but this time it will be short, showing then similarities as well as differences between both currents, Falsafa and tasawwuf. In this context, the most prominent theories of happiness elaborated by thinkers such as Al-Farabi, Miskawayh, and Al-Ghazali will be briefly discussed as case studies. Finally, I will critically reflect on the relevance and suitability of the classical Islamic notion of happiness in today's religious spiritual life, if there will be time for that, otherwise in the discussion. So let's begin with chapter 1, Quranic understanding of happiness. Regarding the Quranic understanding of happiness, there are two main points that I would like to emphasize at the beginning. First, the Quran offers a quite differentiating view on happiness, which is visible already in the usage of different terms denoting happiness or happiness-related human states and situations such as well-being, bliss, good fortune, success, and victory. Semantic is quite broad. Or in Arabic, saʿīda, it's in verb form, aflaḥa or falāḥ, and fāza or Fawz. Second, the Quran refers to two fundamental modes of happiness, a worldly or earthly happiness, happiness in this world, and otherworldly or heavenly happiness, happiness in the hereafter, which is the ultimate happiness. This differentiation of happiness will be later consequently adopted by the majority of Muslim thinkers, especially philosophers, and especially by Al-Farabi and also Al-Ghazali, who in their work refer to the terms saʿāda dunyawiyya and saʿāda ukhrawiyya, or saʿāda ad-dunya and saʿāda al-quswa, in the case of Al-Farabi. There are many Quranic verses that clearly acknowledge the value of worldly goods, but complement them in the divine economy with spiritual goods, as Vincent J. Cornell puts it. One such verse is the verse 201 of the Surah Al-Baqarah, which reads, "Our Lord, grant us the good of this world and of the hereafter, fi dunya hasanat wal fil akhirati hasanat, and protect us from the torment of the fire." Now I will start with the first term, saʿāda or saʿīda. As far as the concept of happiness is concerned, the verbal noun saʿāda, which is the most common Arabic term of happiness used by Islamic philosophers, theologians, and Sufi mystics, is surprisingly nowhere to be found in the Quran. What does appear in the Quran is only a derivation from the verb saʿīda, which is used only twice in the text, both in Surah Al-Hud, which is named after the prophet Hud. In the verse 105 of the mentioned surah, we read, "When the day arrives, no one will dare speak except with his God's permission. Some of them will be miserable or unhappy, shaqiyun, other joyful or happy, saʿīdun." And in the second instance, verse 108, we read, "And as for those destined to joy, or those who attained happiness, they will be in paradise, staying there forever." Now, both of these verses refer to happiness in the afterlife, speaking of the fortunate soul on the day of judgment, and of those who pursued happiness or bliss as residing eternally in heaven. Conversely, those who have been punished by God and cannot reside in heaven are unhappy, shaqi. To show in exemplary way the use of these double connections of saʿāda and shaqawa or shaqa'a, Cornell cites the 15th century Moroccan Sufi Muhammad ibn Sulaiman al-Juzli, best known for his collection of prayers, Dalail al-Khairat, who states, "Know that happiness, saʿāda, is in God. Happiness is in God, His saints, and the prophets of God. And that unhappiness, shaqawa, is in the ego, or in nafs, and what arises from it." So let's move to the second term, to the second word, falāḥ or fariḥa, which appear more frequently in the Quran than saʿīda, and can be also interpreted as a form of mode of happiness, together with other words like Fawz or fariḥa, farh. The Quranic use of the term falāḥ, which along with its derivatives appears not fewer than 40 times in the text, connotes primarily success or prosperity of those who are virtuous and accept God's commands, and refers to both worldly and heavenly happiness. Again, Vincent Cornell notes that the term fariḥa, mostly in the form of aflaḥa, refers much like the utilitarian concept of happiness advocated by John Stuart Mill, to happiness as an inner state of well-being or the fulfillment of spiritual human needs. Such a happiness is, however, in the Quranic context, mostly understood as a recompense for purgative and virtue acts, as for example in the verse 14 of the Surah 87. However, while worldly happiness, denoted by the term fariḥa, includes the pleasure and goods of life, such as well-being, wealth, success, and even status and honor, heavenly happiness implies mainly 4 fundamental aspects. These are eternal life without decay, wealth without poverty, joy without despair, and divine knowledge without deficiency. In short, although fariḥa is used in the Quran for the happiness in this world, as well in the other world, its primary meaning or connotation is similar as in the case of saʿāda, salvific one, so heavenly one. Let's move to the third point, or to the third term, fāza or Fawz. As already mentioned, another term that is used in the Quran connoting a happy state of human being is the noun al-Fawz, and its past tense verb form fāza, which can be translated as victory, triumph, accomplishment also, and successfulness. Considering the Quranic context in which the word al-Fawz appears, it becomes clear that it is associated with goodness, safety, well-being, and achievement of one's own goals in both this life and especially, again, the life to come. An important feature that should be noted in this regard is that al-Fawz ultimately depends on divine mercy. So it's something what we get as a gift and provision of God. The following verse can serve as a good example of the semantics of the Quranic usage of al-Fawz and its derivations. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, we read, "This is the day when only the faithful, as-sadiqun, will benefit from the faithfulness, sidquhum. Theirs are gardens under which river flows to stay there forever and ever. Allah is pleased with them, God is pleased with them, and they are pleased with Him." That is the ultimate triumph in the sense of happiness, al-Fawz al-Azim. Now the last one. Finally, the last important term that can be considered as a part of Quranic semantics of happiness is the verb fariḥa, which most frequent refers to pleasure or joy in this life. The following verse in the Surah At-Tawbah, Repentance, emphasizes an exemplar why this kind of worldly happiness an exemplary way of this worldly happiness, which can be identified with unvirtuous happiness. So we have happiness which is very much connected with virtues, and this can all be an unvirtue happiness. Namely, those hypocrites or disputers who remained behind, rejoiced for doing so in defiance of the messenger of Allah. However, worldly pleasure, joy, and excitement are, in the Quranic context, again, mostly contrasted with the experience of the ultimate happiness that overcomes a believer as a result of divine mercy or grace. For example, in the Surah Ar-Rum, which reads, "If we, God, give people a taste of mercy, they rejoice in it, farihu biha." They rejoice in it, they are happy with it. So a kind of first conclusion here. Many scholars have elaborated on different ways how to pursue happiness from the genuine Quranic perspective. But all the various methods and approaches are essentially be summarized into two main conditions that serve as the key to achieve true happiness, namely faith, al-iman, and righteous deeds. Sincere belief and moral acts are, according to the Quran, two interconnected and I would say also complementary components that in a long term help the believer to attain enduring happiness. Such understanding is grounded in the very Quranic idea that the life of this world is basically a moral test for human beings when they face good or ill fortune. There is also a test when they're facing good to show a gratefulness and so on, a gratitude. As Karen Bauer states in her last article on the Quranic happiness, in the afterlife, God will reward those who pass the test. Key in this regard is that believers should endure through hardship and should be grateful to God equally in difficult moments and in time of ease. One initial point to make about people's satisfaction and rejoicing is that extremes of both rejoicing and despair, when directed towards the things of the world, can detract from one's moral awareness of God as the bestower of good and ill fortune. So we can conclude at this point that the true happiness, as revealed in the Quran, is not to be found solely in worldly achievements, of course, and success, but rather in spiritual satisfaction or fulfillment. We heard about fulfillment today, which includes faith in God, virtues, and righteous deeds. At the same time, it has to be emphasized that the Quran does not preach the total renunciation of the world, desires and pleasures, but rather to try to establish a balance between dunya and akhirah, between this world and world to come. So in the following part, I will focus now on the concept of happiness from the perspective of classical Islamic philosophy. I'm leaving now the terrain of the Quran, and I'm heading to Falsafa. So happiness from the perspective of classical Islamic philosophy. How much time do I have? Okay. In his study on philosophy as a path to happiness, Yann Matilla ascertains, in a reference to Pierre Hadot's work, Qu'est-ce que la philosophie antique, that the idea of philosophy in classical and medieval times was in many ways more spiritual, let's say more practical, more ethics-orientated, than it was to become during the modern period. This characteristic applies generally also to the classical Arabic Islamic philosophy, Falsafa, which despite prioritizing the cognitive intellectual dimension of human being, nonetheless, it also emphasized the practical aspect of a human life, mostly in the context of cultivating the character and attaining moral perfection. So while the main purpose of philosophical engagement was to attain a theoretical understanding of the ultimate nature of reality through rational reasoning, philosophy served, in the end, a more practical goal of man's development toward his highest perfection, conceived as the ultimate happiness. Now, when the classical Muslim philosophers elaborated on the nature of happiness, they almost exclusively used the Arabic term saʿāda, thereby ignoring other Quranic termini, which connote happiness or happiness-related states. I mentioned them already. One of the reasons for this selective or specific semantics of happiness preferred by the Muslim philosophers can be seen, it's just a suggestion, can be seen in the strong relationship between the Falsafa tradition and the Greek Hellenistic philosophy, in which the notion of eudaimonia, of course, dominated the discourse. The Islamic philosophical concept of saʿāda therefore strongly resonate with the Aristotelian notion of eudaimonia, principally connoting happiness with regard to virtues or virtuous activity in accordance with reason, supported by the goods of both body and soul. Similarly, the Islamic philosophers, Falāḥa, argue that the goal of good character is happiness. The goal of good character is happiness, and that in order to produce virtue and good character, the animal soul and its bodily faculties must be subordinated to the practical faculty of the rational soul, which directs individual action after deliberation in accord with what agrees with theoretical faculty. So in the following part, I would like to very briefly illustrate this philosophical approach towards the question of happiness using the example of Al-Farabi and Miskawayh, who have extensively reflected on the concept of saʿāda. So I will begin chronologically with Abu Nasr al-Farabi. Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who came to be known as the second teacher, al-Muallim al-Thani, after, of course, Aristotle, who was considered as the first teacher, was a Muslim polymath, and the first thinker, actually, who not only systemized and classified philosophical sciences in the Islamic world, but also developed a comprehensive philosophical system on his own. One of his most important works on ethics is Kitab Tahsil al-Saʿāda, the book of the attainment of happiness, in which he categorizes different types of happiness and elaborates on the methods and conditions how to achieve it. If I was to summarize his central points, Al-Farabi first emphasizes that the theoretical knowledge should be put into action in the form of moral conduct in order to be truly meaningful. If the knowledge becomes meaningful, that means practical, useful, and in some sense even existential, it leads a man to morally good life and inner fulfillment, which finally creates happiness already during this worldly existence. According to Al-Farabi, there are 4 fundamental types of virtues, al-fada'il, that people should acquire in order to lead a good, morally and self-fulfilling life, and consequently to gain happiness in this world, as-saʿāda, ad-dunya, fil hayat al-ula, as well as in the hereafter, as-saʿāda al-quswa fil hayat al-ukhra. These 4 categories of virtues are theoretical virtue, al-fada'il al-nazariyya, intellectual virtue, al-fada'il al-fikriyya, moral virtues, al-fada'il al-khuluqiyya, and 4th, practical or pragmatic skills, as-sinaat al-amaliyya. I won't go now into the details, but however, for Al-Farabi, a special place among all the sciences and modes of knowledge has, of course, philosophy, since it is the only discipline which is able to explain the essence of existence of all things by providing certain rational evidences, barahin yaqiniyya. If one acquires this kind of knowledge by means of intensive philosophical engagement, he gains profound understanding of the nature of existence and of his own place in the cosmos. So it's a very intellectual enterprise. Since such realization represents for Al-Farabi the highest perfection, al-kamal al-akhir, that a human can achieve, it also signifies the ultimate happiness, as saʿāda al-quswa. As Janne Matilla correctly notes, the ultimate reason for which philosophy is practiced in the first place lies in its saving function of leading man towards his greatest happiness, which inherently integrates the pursuit of practical moral perfection. I will move now to Ibn Miskawayh, the second protagonist. We can observe a similar attitude, actually, towards the question of happiness, also by Al-Farabi's perhaps most famous philosophical successor, Ibn Miskawayh, at least in the field of Islamic ethics, the author of an important treatise on ethics, Tahdib al-Akhlaq, refinement of character. According to Miskawayh, virtues should be perceived as a means to man's ultimate goal, that is, moral perfection again, that corresponds with happiness as an inner state of mind and soul. In this context, Miskawayh argues that man partakes in 2 fundamental and complementary activities, intellectual and practical. To the former corresponds a cognitive perfection, kamal alimi, whereas to the latter, a moral one, kamal khuluqi. the cognitive perfection of man, which for Miskawayh manifests itself in direct conjunction or contact, ittisal, with the intelligible world, is in relation to the moral perfection as form is to the matter, so that the perfection of or happiness corresponding to it, it's proportionately higher. In contrast to Al-Farabi, however, who considers the moral virtue and even a social political dimension of human life as a necessary condition for pursuing the true happiness, even Miskawayh acknowledges that only by achieving the intellectual perfection by receiving the divine wisdom, man will transcend the trials and tribulations of terrestrial existence, as well as deceptions and frustrations of the bodily pleasures. When man attains this kind of inner condition, shaped by the intellectual enjoyment, his consciousness transforms completely and he will become immune to suffering. Fully pleased with himself and content with his condition and the emanations he receives from the light of the One. He will derive no other pleasure save from these conditions, is delighted with nothing save these beauties, and is not jubilant save the prospect of revealing the wisdom to those who are worthy of it. In his other important work on happiness, Kitab al-Saʿāda, the Book of Happiness, Miskawayh also emphasizes the liberating self-contentment, let's say, of an individual who has achieved the highest realization and gained the ultimate happiness, which is an end in itself. It's not a mean to something else, but it's an end in itself. The happy man, says Miskawayh, saʿīd, the happy man, he writes, is self-contented because he perceives certain immutable realities which neither change or are liable to change. He sees everything he sees with the eyes of the one who does not err or stumble, and it is not liable to corruption. His energy, his peace of mind and joy are heightened. This condition of confidence and self-assurance is not simply a matter of report, of knowledge from outside, khabar, but unconformed by actual vision, mu'ayyana. And he concludes, the soul does not rest in it until the truth has been grasped. So again, very intellectual. However, the question that can legitimately be raised, in my opinion, in this context is, of course, how accessible is this perfection to all? Hence, it seems to be more a feature of an extraordinary sage, hakim, than of an ordinary man. But although one can get the impression that the ultimate happiness presented by Miskawayh especially is indeed attainable only by the privileged few, it is nonetheless a potentiality inherent to the earthly existence of all human beings. Besides, Miskawayh's conception of happiness is not so purely an intellectual or cognitive enterprise as might appear, but also a matter of action or practice, even though the former is superior to the latter. He writes, neither can be complete without the other, for knowledge is a beginning and action an end. A beginning without an end is wasted, and an end without a beginning is impossible. So that's the relationship at the end of the day between knowledge and action from the perspective of Miskawayh. I hope you can bear with me last part, which is my favorite favorable part, but this time will be short. Happiness from the perspective of Islamic mysticism, tasawwuf. Finally, we will take a brief look at a more mystical approach to the question of happiness from the perspective of Sufism, of tasawwuf. Without getting into details on the complexity and variety and richness of the phenomena of Islamic mysticism, I would at this point only like to emphasize that Sufism can be, broadly speaking, regarded, and I agree here with this definition, can be, broadly speaking, regarded as a sphere of spiritual experiences which runs parallel to the mainstream of Islamic consciousness, deriving from prophetic revelation and comprehended with the Sharia and theology, in most cases. The Sufi mystics emphasize the inner purification, tazkiyatun nafs, on the one hand, and the proximity, qurb, to the divine on the other hand. The latter enable a believer to experience philosophic and overwhelming states of consciousness. Although many Sufis considered the possibility of attaining the beatific vision of God, visio beatifica, or shuhud in Arabic term, as an act of divine grace already in this life, it is ultimately about the attaining happiness in the hereafter. Besides that, Sufi authors rarely use explicitly the term happiness, saʿāda, to describe the highest spiritual experiences, but rather rephrase it with a whole range of the terms which connote joyful, beatific, ecstatic, or happiness-alike inner conditions, feelings, and state of consciousness, among which are best known or best established an Arabic term, bast, joyful expansion of consciousness, wajd, ecstatic experience or mystical rapture, mushahada, beatific vision of God, ilham, divine inspiration, mahabba, mystical love, shawq, passionate, stimulating longing for God, and dhawq, extrasensory tasting, the divine nearness. Dhawq is the term for taste, but they are meaning not the sensory taste, but metaphysical taste. And there is even a proverb which goes, man daqa arafa, the one who tastes realized, really. However, with Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, to come to my third protagonist, we have a good example of a prominent Ashari theologian and an influential Sufi scholar who elaborated extensively on happiness, using explicitly the term saʿāda, and second, who considered it possible to pursue the happiness already in this life, although again giving priority to the ultimate happiness in the hereafter. In the foreword to his famous work on happiness, originally written in Persian, Kemiya Sa'adat, the Alchemy of Happiness, Al-Ghazali explains that, quote, man was not created in jest or random, but for some higher purpose and some higher or some greater end. This greater final goal that can essentially be reached only by the alchemy of inner purification and spiritual transformation, for Al-Ghazali, is none other than human perfection, manifested in his moral spiritual purity, ihsan, and divine gnosis, ma'arifa. If man achieves such an inner condition or state of consciousness, he attains happiness, saʿāda. So far, Al-Ghazali. But The essence of this spiritual alchemy lies for Al-Ghazali in turning away from the world to God, firstly, at least the first step, then turning again to the world. And it consists of 4 modes of knowledge: the knowledge of one's own soul, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of reality, and the knowledge of hereafter. Although Al-Ghazali holds for possible that one can gain happiness already in this life, if he goes through the inner alchemy and convert vices into virtues by means of spiritual practices, the ultimate happiness can, however, be achieved only in the afterlife, when the soul is totally free from the bodily passions and senses. Since the subtle heart, qalb in Arabic, which is the very spiritual essence of human being, Al-Ghazali referred to it as latifatun, rabbaniyatun, ruhaniyatun, does not belong to the visible world, but to the invisible world, and has come into this world as a traveler, he says. As a traveler visits a foreign country for the sake of the merchandise and will presently return to its native land. Yet besides purification and knowledge, there is a third element, which for Al-Ghazali at least is constitutive for pursuing human perfection and happiness, an element we didn't speak much about it. It's love. Love. He states categorically that love is the seed of happiness, and love to God is fostered and developed by worship. So there are mutual relationship between worship and love. You can, so to say, cultivate love with worship and remembrance of God and so on. Such loving worship and constant remembrance of God implies a certain degree of austerity and curbing of bodily appetites. He adds, though, that a man is not intended to abolish appetites and passion altogether, for then the human race would perish. So, conclusion, I think. Perfect. Huh? Wait, I'm not finished here now. But don't worry. 5 minutes, it will do it. I have just one slide. Huh? Yeah, thank you. So, conclusion. So, at the end of the day, from the Islamic perspective, happiness is a result of a fruit of the right relationship between man and God, and consequently between man and the whole of creation. It is fundamentally a virtue-conditioned happiness. Virtue-conditioned happiness, very strong virtue and knowledge-oriented happiness, which is from the Quranic perspective the only happiness worth pursuing. But against this background, perhaps this kind of happiness is ultimately not the real object of desire and aspiration of human beings, but rather a necessary byproduct of good, righteous, pious, and virtuous life that one is potentially able to live despite all the temptations, difficulties, and challenges in this world. We saw clearly that the concept of happiness, which the Quran and the Islamic spiritual ethical tradition is primarily referring to, is not so much a question of external circumstances, but rather of internal condition and inner orientation of the believer. True happiness is, according to Islamic tradition in general and to the Quran in particular, identified ultimately as a paradisical state. That is the state of those who pass the test, again, of life and reach the heavenly paradise. That means in turn that we can never be fully and continually happy in this world, which again means that we are essentially not made solely for this world, but for another world, for a world to come. Sayyid Hossein Nasr, to conclude with him, beautifully and correctly observed that the very fact that a human being with all his physical needs and psychological demands of his lower passionate soul can never be fully satisfied implies that a human fundamentally, this implies that a human is fundamentally a spiritual being whose last destination, a eschatological destination, transcends the worldly realm. So, unhappiness itself, as an existential expression of our ontological and metaphysical incompleteness, is proof of our essential spiritual nature, fitra. And it is not, and now the question, the final question, is it not this fundamental notion of the genuine spiritual predisposition of man that is common feature of all religious worldviews? Thank you very much for your patience.